The blood was everywhere, on my hands, on my uniform, seeping through the fabric and into my skin like it was searching for something deeper to contaminate. The man in front of me, God, I can barely call him a man anymore. His face was gone, not burned away, not torn off, just gone, melted into something that belonged in nightmares, not in the emergency ward of Pripyat Hospital. His eyes, though, his eyes were still there, staring at me with a plea I'll never forget. "Please," he whispered through what remained of his mouth, "don't let me die like this." I wanted to promise him something, anything, but the Geiger counter on the wall was screaming, and I knew we were all walking into hell. Some stories choose you. They crawl into your bones and make a home there, refusing to leave even decades later. This is one of those stories, a memory that glows in the dark, radioactive and eternal. If you found your way here to this forgotten corner of history, then you're ready to hear something most people can't bear. Before we descend into that April night in 1986, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button. Not for views, not for numbers, but because what you're about to hear needs witnesses. These voices from Chernobyl, they're fading. The radiation took most of them, and time is taking the rest. Comment below if you've heard whispers of this story before. If someone in your family carried these scars home with them. Help me keep these memories alive, because forgetting is the only real death, the only way they truly lose. My name is Elena Kozlova, and I was 24 years old when the world ended. Not the whole world, just mine, and everyone else's, within a 30-kilometer radius of Reactor 4. I was a registered nurse at Pripyat Hospital, working the night shift that would change everything. It was April 26, 1986, and I had been on duty for 6 hours when the first ambulances started arriving. Before that night, I thought I understood suffering. I thought I had seen the worst that human flesh could endure. I was wrong. Pripyat was a young city, built for young people. Soviet engineers and their families, nuclear workers and their children. We called it the city of the future, with its gleaming apartment blocks and wide boulevards lined with tadris that would never grow old. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was our provider, our protector, our pride. We lived in its shadow and felt safe there. The atom was our friend, they told us. Clean energy for a clean future. We believed them because we had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. I had been working at the hospital for 3 years, long enough to know every crack in the ceiling, every stain on the floor that wouldn't come clean. The night shift was usually quiet. A few drunks with split lips, the occasional construction accident, maybe a woman in labor if we were lucky. Nothing prepared us for what was coming. Nothing could have. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and cigarettes. That particular Soviet combination that followed you home and clung to your clothes. We had 40 beds, basic equipment, and a staff that was competent but not prepared for miracles. Dr. Belokon was the chief physician, a man in his 50s who had seen the war and thought nothing could shock him anymore. Nurse Valentina worked days and had a laugh that could wake the dead. Igor, our orderly, was barely 18 and still believed the world was fundamentally good. We were a family, in that forced way that small workplaces become families. We looked after each other. My apartment was a 10-minute walk from the hospital, on the 4th floor of a building that looked exactly like every other building in Pripyat. Gray concrete, small windows, and walls thin enough that you knew your neighbors better than you wanted to. I lived alone, which was unusual for a young woman, but I had convinced the housing committee that my shift work made me a difficult roommate. The truth was, I needed silence. I needed a place where I could think, where I could process the things I saw at work without having to explain them to anyone else. That April night started like any other. I arrived at the hospital at 10 p.m., checked the logbook, counted the supplies. We had 3 patients, an old man recovering from pneumonia, a middle-aged woman with diabetes, and a teenager who had broken his arm showing off for his girlfriend. Routine, boring, safe. I made my rounds, checked temperatures, distributed medications. By midnight, I was reading a novel behind the nurse's station. Something about love and betrayal that seemed impossibly naive in retrospect. The phone rang at 1:23 a.m. I remember the exact time because I looked at the clock and thought about how the sound had shattered the peaceful silence. Dr. Bellicon answered, and I watched his face change as he listened. His skin went gray, then white, then gray again. He hung up and stared at the phone like it might ring again with better news. "Get ready," he said, and his voice was different, smaller. "There's been an accident at the plant. They're bringing casualties. An accident at the plant." Such small words for such an enormous thing. I asked him what kind of accident, how many casualties, what we should prepare for. He didn't know. Nobody knew. The first responders were still trying to understand what they were looking at, and the plant officials weren't saying anything beyond minor technical difficulty. But something in Dr. Bellicon's eyes told me this wasn't minor, and it certainly wasn't technical. I started preparing the emergency ward, checking supplies, setting up beds. Igor arrived early for his shift, called in by the same mysterious phone tree that had alerted the doctor. Nurse Valentina came in too, still in her nightgown under her coat, her hair uncombed and her eyes wide with the particular fear that comes from being woken up by bad news. We worked in silence, arranging instruments we hoped we wouldn't need, preparing for something we couldn't imagine. The first ambulance arrived at 2:47 a.m. I remember because I was watching the clock, counting the minutes since the phone call, trying to measure the size of the disaster by how long it was taking to reach us. The sound of the siren was wrong somehow. Too urgent, too desperate. Ambulance drivers usually have a casual relationship with emergency, saving their panic for the truly hopeless cases. This driver was panicking. Dr. Bellicon went out to meet them, and I followed. The night air was warm for April, unusually warm, and there was a taste to it that I couldn't identify. Metallic, maybe. Sweet in a way that made your stomach turn. The ambulance doors opened, and the first firefighter was carried out on a stretcher. He was conscious, which seemed like a good sign until you looked closer. His skin was red. Not the red of a sunburn, but something deeper, angrier. His hair was coming out in clumps, stuck to the stretcher, padding like autumn leaves. But his eyes were alert, and he was trying to talk to the paramedic, trying to explain what had happened, trying to make sense of something that couldn't be explained. "Where do you want him?" the paramedic asked, and there was something wrong with his voice too. Shaky, professional calm fighting against rising hysteria. Dr. Bellicon pointed to the emergency ward, and we wheeled the stretcher inside. The firefighter's name was Alexei, and he was 26 years old. He had been one of the first to respond to what they were calling a fire at Reactor 4. He had climbed ladders, hauled hoses, breathed in smoke that tasted like copper and lightning. He didn't know yet that he had just received a lethal dose of radiation. None of us did. The second ambulance arrived 15 minutes later, then a third, then a fourth. By dawn, we had 12 patients, all of them showing the same symptoms. The red skin, the hair loss, the nausea that came in waves. Dr. Bellicon had called the regional medical authority, but they seemed as confused as we were. Treat them for severe burns. they said. Monitor for shock and infection. Standard protocol for standard injuries. But nothing about this was standard. I took Alexei's vital signs and started an IV drip. His pulse was elevated but steady. His blood pressure low but not dangerously so. He could answer questions, tell me his name and age and address. He seemed almost normal until you looked at his hands. The skin was loose like a glove that didn't fit properly. When I tried to tape down his IV line, the tape pulled away skin that came off in sheets. "Is it bad?" he asked me, and I didn't know how to answer. How do you tell someone that their DNA is unraveling, that their cells are dying from the inside out, that the very atoms in their body have been poisoned by something invisible and unstoppable? I told him he would be fine, that we would take good care of him. It was the first of many lies I would tell that morning. The other patients were worse. Pyotr, another firefighter, was vomiting blood and couldn't keep his eyes open. Dmitri, a plant operator, had burns on his hands and face that went deeper than skin, deeper than muscle, down to something essential and irreparable. Valery was unconscious when they brought him in, his breathing shallow and irregular. We did what we could. IV fluids, pain medication, antibiotics to prevent infection. But we were fighting an enemy we couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't defeat. By 6 a.m., word had spread through Pripyat that something serious had happened at the plant. People started gathering outside the hospital, trying to get information about our husbands, brothers, friends who worked the night shift. We had no answers to give them. The official line was still minor technical difficulty. But the evidence in our emergency ward told a different story. These men were dying, and we didn't know why or how to stop it. Dr. Belokon called Moscow directly, breaking protocol and probably ending his career in the process. He described the symptoms, the timeline, the number of casualties. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then a voice that sounded very far away. "Do not discuss this with anyone. Specialists are on their way." The line went dead, and we were alone with our dying patients and our growing fear. The specialists arrived on a military helicopter at 8 a.m. They wore protective suits that covered them completely, with face masks and breathing apparatus that made them look like aliens. They carried instruments I had never seen before, boxes with clicking sounds, devices with digital displays that showed numbers I didn't understand. They moved through our emergency ward like they were walking through a contaminated zone, which I realized with growing horror. They were. "How long have you been treating these patients?" One of them asked me through his face mask. His voice was muffled but urgent. I told him about 6 hours, since just after midnight. He looked at his clicking box, then at me, then back at the box. "Have you been wearing protective equipment?" I told him no, that we hadn't been told to wear anything special. He made a note on a clipboard and moved on to the next patient. I wanted to ask him what the box was measuring, what the numbers meant, why he was wearing a suit while I was standing there in scrubs and surgical gloves. But something in his manner told me I didn't want to know the answers. They worked quickly and efficiently, taking blood samples, measuring radiation levels, documenting symptoms. They spoke to each other in technical terms I didn't recognize, but their tone was clear enough. These men were going to die, probably within days, and there was nothing anyone could do to save them. The radiation had damaged them at the cellular level, disrupting the basic processes that keep a human body functioning. They were walking corpses, kept alive by momentum and medical intervention, but already claimed by the invisible fire that had consumed Reactor 4. Alexei was still conscious when the specialists examined him. He tried to joke with them, asking if his hair would grow back, if he would be able to return to work soon. They measured the radiation levels coming from his body and exchanged glances. One of them made a phone call, speaking quietly in a corner of the room. When he finished, he came back to Dr. Bellicon and spoke in a voice that tried to sound casual, but carried the weight of a death sentence. These patients need to be transferred to Moscow immediately. We have facilities there that are better equipped to handle their condition. Moscow, 600 kilometers away, a place where they could die out of sight, away from their families, away from the questions and panic that would follow. I understood then that this wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a state secret, something too dangerous for ordinary people to know about. We were being asked to participate in a cover-up to help hide the magnitude of what had happened. The transfer began immediately. Military trucks with lead-lined compartments, like mobile coffins, designed to contain something too dangerous for the outside world. One by one, our patients were loaded and driven away. Alexei was last. As they wheeled him toward the truck, he grabbed my hand with strength that surprised me. "Don't forget us," he said. His skin was coming off on my fingers, but his eyes were clear and desperate. "Whatever they tell you happened here. Don't forget what you saw." I promised him I wouldn't. A promise that has haunted me for 37 years. After the trucks left, a different team arrived to decontaminate the hospital. They measured radiation levels on every surface, in every room. The emergency ward was sealed with tape and warning signs. Our equipment was bagged and taken away. We were told to shower with special soap, to dispose of our uniforms, to submit to blood tests that would be repeated weekly for the next year. The official explanation was that we had been exposed to minor contamination that posed no serious health risk. Another lie in a chain of lies that would define everything that followed. But the worst part wasn't the fear of radiation or the knowledge that we had been deceived. It was the silence. Within hours, the official story had solidified. There had been a minor accident at the plant, quickly contained with no danger to the surrounding population. The firefighters and plant workers had been treated for burns and transferred to specialized facilities for routine care. Life in Pripyat would continue normally. Anyone who suggested otherwise would be guilty of spreading panic and undermining state security. I tried to talk to Dr. Bellicon about what we had seen, what we had experienced. He looked at me with eyes that had aged decades in a single night and shook his head. "We treated some burn patients," he said carefully. "They recovered and were transferred to better facilities. That's all that happened." He wouldn't meet my gaze, wouldn't acknowledge the truth we both knew. The fear had gotten to him. The same fear that was spreading through Pripyat like radiation itself. Invisible, persistent, and deadly. The next few days passed in a surreal haze of normalcy and underlying terror. People went to work, children went to school, families had dinner together and planned weekend activities. But underneath the surface, whispers spread like infection. Plant workers reported unusual symptoms: headaches, nausea, a metallic taste that wouldn't go away. Geiger counters in the hands of those brave enough to own them clicked frantically near anything that had come from the plant. Dogs and cats began dying in unusual numbers, their fur falling out in patches that resembled the symptoms we had seen in our patients. I found myself unable to sleep, unable to eat, unable to concentrate on anything except the memory of Alexei's hand in mine and the feeling of his skin dissolving under my fingers. I kept thinking about the specialists in their protective suits, about the instruments that clicked and displayed numbers that meant death. I started researching radiation exposure, reading medical texts in the hospital library, trying to understand what I had witnessed. What I learned terrified me. Acute radiation syndrome progresses in predictable stages. Initial nausea and vomiting, followed by a latent period where victims feel better, then the final stage where bone marrow fails, immune systems collapse, and death comes slowly and painfully. Our patients had been in the first stage when we treated them. By now, if they were still alive, they would be experiencing the false hope of the latent period, feeling better and believing they might recover. Soon they would enter the final stage, and there would be nothing anyone could do but make them comfortable while they died. I tried to find out what had happened to them, to get word from the Moscow hospitals where they had been taken, but the information was classified, restricted to authorized personnel only. As far as the official record was concerned, those 12 men had ceased to exist the moment they were loaded into those lead-lined trucks. They had become state secrets, their suffering and death hidden behind walls of bureaucracy and denial. 3 days after the accident, buses began arriving in Pripyat, hundreds of them, forming convoys that stretched for kilometers down the main highway. The announcement came over loudspeakers mounted throughout the city. Due to a minor technical problem at the plant, residents would be temporarily evacuated for their own safety. Pack light, we were told. You'll be back in a few days. Take only essential items. Don't panic. This is just a precaution. I knew it was a lie. The specialists in their protective suits, the sealed emergency ward, the disappearance of our patients, none of that suggested a minor technical problem. This was a disaster of unprecedented scale, something so terrible that the government was willing to evacuate an entire city rather than admit what had really happened. 50,000 people were being forced to abandon their homes, their lives, their future, and they weren't even being told why. I packed a single bag with clothes and photographs, the same bag I had been carrying when I left my apartment that morning 3 days earlier for what I thought would be a routine shift at the hospital. I looked around at the life I was leaving behind, books on the shelves, plants on the windowsill, a half-finished letter to my sister in Kiev that would never be sent. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had, but it felt different now. Contaminated by knowledge and fear. The bus ride to the relocation center took 6 hours. 6 hours of forced silence and shared terror. Children pressed their faces against windows, watching their city disappear behind them. Adults stared straight ahead or whispered quietly to each other, trying to process what was happening. I found myself thinking about Alexei and the others, wondering if they were still alive. If they knew what their sacrifice had bought, the evacuation of Pripyat, the acknowledgement that something truly terrible had occurred. The relocation center was a collection of temporary buildings hastily erected in a field outside Kiev. Thousands of people crammed into spaces designed for hundreds, sharing bathrooms, meals, and the growing realization that we would never go home again. Officials moved among us with clipboards and measuring devices, asking questions about our health, our work, our families. They were gathering data, I realized, trying to understand the full scope of the contamination, the number of people who had been exposed, the potential long-term health effects. I was questioned separately because of my work at the hospital, because I had direct contact with the most severely exposed victims. A man in a gray suit asked me about symptoms, about the condition of the patients when they arrived, about the procedures we had followed. I answered truthfully, describing what I had seen and done. He took notes and asked follow-up questions, but never once acknowledged what we both knew, that I had been exposed to lethal levels of radiation and would probably die within a year. The medical examinations began immediately. Blood tests, urine samples, full body scans, with equipment I didn't recognize. The results were never shared with us, filed away in folders marked with codes and classifications that meant nothing to civilians, but everything to the specialists who were tracking our slow destruction. We were test subjects now, guinea pigs in an experiment to measure the effects of radiation exposure on human populations. Weeks passed, then months. The temporary housing became permanent. The emergency measures became policy. We were scattered across Ukraine and Russia, relocated to cities and towns that had space for atomic refugees. I was sent to a small industrial city north of Kiev, given a job at a local clinic, and assigned to an apartment that felt like a prison cell. Everything I had known, everyone I had cared about, was gone, erased as completely as if it had never existed. The medical monitoring continued. Monthly checkups, quarterly evaluations, annual comprehensive examinations. The doctors were kind but distant, professional but guarded. They measured and documented and filed reports, but they never told us what they were finding, what the numbers meant, what our futures looked like. We were data points in a vast study of human suffering, our lives reduced to statistics and symptoms. I began experiencing health problems within the first year. Fatigue that never lifted, headaches that came and went without warning, a persistent cough that tasted like metal. My hair started falling out in clumps, just like our patients had experienced that night at the hospital. I developed skin problems, digestive issues, joint pain that made it difficult to work. The doctors noted everything, prescribed medications that didn't help, and scheduled more tests. But the worst part wasn't the physical symptoms. It was the silence, the isolation, the knowledge that I was carrying death inside me and couldn't share that burden with anyone who would understand. My family was told I had been exposed to industrial contamination and might experience minor health effects. My friends were given vague explanations about a workplace accident. I was forbidden from discussing the details of what had happened that night, what I had seen and done, what it meant for my future. I tried to return to normal life, but normal no longer existed. Every headache might be the beginning of brain cancer. Every fever might signal immune system collapse. Every moment of fatigue might be my body finally succumbing to the radiation that had been eating away at my cells for months. I was living in a state of constant anticipation, waiting for death while pretending to be alive. The others who had been there that night, Dr. Belokon, Nurse Valentina Igor, were scattered like seeds in the wind, relocated to different cities with different stories to explain their absence. I tried to contact them to find out how they were coping, but the letters came back marked address unknown or recipient relocated. We had become ghosts. Our shared experience too dangerous to acknowledge, too terrible to discuss. Years passed. The Soviet Union collapsed. The secret archives were opened, and the truth about Chernobyl began to emerge. Books were written, documentaries were made, survivors were interviewed, but by then most of the witnesses were dead, claimed by cancers and organ failures and mysterious illnesses that couldn't be definitively linked to radiation exposure but followed patterns that were impossible to ignore. I survived longer than expected, longer than the specialists thought possible. My hair grew back, my symptoms stabilized, my test results showed improvement. The doctors called it a miracle, an example of the human body's remarkable ability to heal itself. But I knew the truth. The radiation was still there, still working, still changing me at the cellular level. It would never go away, never stop, never allow me to forget what had happened that night. I began keeping a journal, writing down everything I could remember about those first hours after the explosion. The details were fading, not because of memory loss, but because of the sheer impossibility of what I had experienced. How do you describe the feeling of holding dissolving flesh in your hands? How do you explain the sound a Geiger counter makes when it encounters something too dangerous to measure? How do you capture the look in a dying man's eyes when he realizes that his government has abandoned him? The journal became my confession, my testimony, my attempt to honor the promise I had made to Alexei. "Don't forget us," he had said. "Don't forget what you saw." For 37 years, I have carried that burden, that responsibility to remember and to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The firefighters who ran toward the reactor, not away from it. The plant operators who stayed at their posts, trying to prevent an even greater catastrophe. The medical personnel who treated the contaminated without protection or preparation. They were heroes, all of them, though the word feels inadequate to describe what they endured. They faced the invisible fire with courage and dedication, knowing they were probably going to die, but believing their sacrifice might save others. They were right. Their actions prevented an even greater disaster, saved countless lives, bought time for evacuation and containment. But their heroism was buried along with their bodies, hidden behind official secrecy and political calculation. I am 71 years old now, one of the few remaining witnesses to that night in April 1986. The radiation has taken most of my colleagues, my patients, my fellow survivors. Cancer, heart disease, immune system failures, the delayed effects of acute exposure playing out over decades. I have outlived expectations, outlasted predictions, somehow dodged the bullet that claimed so many others. But the bullet is still there, still traveling, still aimed at what remains of my life. My body survived, but my soul remained in that contaminated emergency ward, holding the hands of dying men and promising them they would be remembered. I have spent 37 years trying to keep that promise, trying to find words for experiences that exist beyond language, trying to make sense of a disaster that defies comprehension. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl is still there, still radioactive, still dangerous. Nature has reclaimed the abandoned city of Pripyat, turning streets into forests and buildings into ruins. Tourist groups visit now, wearing protective equipment and carrying Geiger counters, taking photographs of the disaster site like it's a museum exhibit. They see the physical remnants of the catastrophe, the abandoned amusement park, the empty schools, the reactor entombed in concrete. But they can't see what I see when I close my eyes. I see Alexei's face, still young and hopeful despite the radiation that was killing him. I see the emergency ward with its clicking instruments and desperate activity. I see the specialists in their protective suits, measuring death with scientific precision. I see the buses filled with refugees, the temporary shelters, the scattered families. I see the truth that was too terrible to acknowledge, too dangerous to speak. That truth is simple and horrible. We were all expendable. The firefighters, the plant workers, the medical personnel, the citizens of Pripyat. We were all acceptable losses in a system that valued secrecy over safety, ideology over human life. We were sacrificed to protect the reputation of nuclear power, to maintain the illusion of Soviet technological superiority, to avoid the political consequences of admitting that the unthinkable had happened. But we existed. We mattered. Our suffering was real. Our sacrifice was meaningful. Our stories deserved to be told. The radiation may have taken our health, our homes, our futures, but it couldn't take our humanity, our dignity, our right to be remembered. We were there when the world ended and began again, when the atom showed its terrible face, when the future revealed its price. I don't know how much time I have left. The doctors can't say. Radiation exposure affects everyone differently, and I have already survived longer than anyone expected. My body may have been spared the worst effects, but my mind carries scars that will never heal. I dream about that night, about the patients we couldn't save, about the promises we couldn't keep. I wake up tasting metal and feeling the ghost of dissolving skin on my fingers. This is my testimony, my witness, my final attempt to honor the memory of those who didn't survive to tell their own stories. Their names were Alexei and Pyotr and Dmitri and Valery and 8 others whose identities were classified along with their deaths. They were young men with families and dreams and futures that were stolen from them in a single night. They deserve better than to be forgotten, better than to be reduced to statistics in a classified report. They deserve to be remembered as heroes who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. They deserve to be honored as human beings who suffered and died in service to something larger than themselves. They deserve to have their stories told, their sacrifices acknowledged, their names spoken with respect and gratitude. I am Elena Kozlova, and I was there when Chernobyl happened. I held the hands of dying heroes. I breathed radioactive air. I carried contamination in my cells for 37 years. The accident ended decades ago, but for me, for all of us who were there, it never really ended. It lives inside us like a second heartbeat, a constant reminder of how quickly everything can change, how thin the line is between civilization and catastrophe. The exclusion zone will remain dangerous for thousands of years. The radioactive isotopes released that night have half-lives longer than human civilization, longer than recorded history. But the human cost of Chernobyl can't be measured in REM or Curie's or cancer rates. It's measured in broken promises, in scattered families, in stories that were never supposed to be told. It's measured in the silence that followed, in the lives that were erased, in the truth that was buried deeper than any radioactive waste. I am one of the last witnesses, one of the few who can still speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. My voice is fading, my memory is clouding, my time is running out. But while I can still draw breath, I will continue to tell this story, to honor this promise, to keep alive the memory of that terrible night when the atom turned against its creators and showed us the true cost of our hubris. Some memories fade with time, softened by distance and wishful thinking, but this memory remains as sharp as broken glass, as radioactive as the core of Reactor 4. It glows in the dark of my dreams. It whispers in the silence between heartbeats. It reminds me every day that I survived something that was never supposed to happen, witnessed something that was never supposed to be seen. This is not just my story. It's the story of everyone who was touched by Chernobyl, everyone who lost something to the invisible fire, everyone whose life was divided into before and after that April night in 1986. We are the forgotten ones, the expendable ones, the ones whose stories were too dangerous to tell. But we existed. We mattered. We deserved to be remembered. The reactor is entombed now, buried under concrete and steel. But the truth can't be contained so easily. It leaks out in stories like this one, in testimonies from survivors, in the empty buildings of Pripyat, where radiation levels are still too high for human habitation. The truth is patient and persistent, and eventually, It finds a way to the surface. My body may have survived, but my soul remained in that contaminated emergency ward, holding the hands of dying heroes and promising them they would never be forgotten. This is my attempt to keep that promise, to ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain, to make sure that the truth about Chernobyl survives, even if we don't. Some memories fade, but this one must never be forgotten. Subscribe and share to keep the voices of the past alive. These stories need witnesses. These testimonies need guardians. These promises need keepers. The radiation took almost everything from us, but it couldn't take our humanity, our dignity, our right to be remembered. Help me ensure that the heroes of Chernobyl are never forgotten, that their sacrifice is never diminished, that their truth is never silenced, because forgetting is the only real death, and they have died enough already.